Hi, I'm Ethan Wong, and today I'm here with Daniel Poppick.
Hi, Ethan. Hi, everyone. I'm Daniel Poppick, Dan, for the purposes of this conversation. I live in Brooklyn, New York. I'm a poet, and I'm really glad to be here.
All right, we'll get straight into the questions.
All right.
So something I ask a lot of poets is, when did you first fall in love with poetry? How did it become a thing for you? And what mentally shifted you from becoming a writer of it rather than just a reader of it?
It's a great question. I came to poetry relatively late compared to a lot of the poets that I know. Most poets I know started writing in like middle school or elementary school even. Sorry, it's a little noisy out there. I just moved to a new apartment and the sound of the traffic is, it's working its way into my life. Anyway, I was saying, a lot of people I know started writing poetry when they were young. I started writing probably when I was in my late in college, early 20s. I thought of myself as a fiction writer for a long time, and that's what I wanted to do. And then poetry, I sort of fell into my life accidentally, and it just made sense in a way that nothing else had before. And so that's sort of the short version of it.
It's interesting because, I mean, yeah, definitely even with me, it was in middle school or early high school that I really got into poetry. So, I mean, what kind of, you can elaborate, or if you could elaborate, I guess, on how that kind of happened and ultimately what ended up being special about poetry as opposed to the other fiction writing that you had been doing.
Well, I think that poetry just makes language strange again, I think. And language seemed like the clearest tool that I had. I mean, it was the best tool that I had to make sense of the world. I felt like when I had a hold of language growing up that I had an understanding of what was going on around me. And so if poetry could make language strange again, then it felt like it just opened up possibilities for everything that I experienced. If you could describe, this is sort of a cliche almost, but one of the first poems that I really loved was 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird by Wallace Stevens. And if you could describe a blackbird in 13 or really infinite, an infinite number of ways, then, what were the possibilities for something, bigger than that, for thinking about anything. Poetry just seemed to refresh experience. So.
Yeah, I think definitely because when I write poetry, there's this feeling almost as if sometimes the way the lines come out, it's like, I don't know, and I hesitate to put it quite this way, but it's like sometimes I don't even know what I'm writing, or it's like the way the language naturally wants to flow out is just so incongruous sometimes. And it's like that's the part about poetry that I never get, like writing an essay or like writing normal fiction or anything like that.
I think that you put that much more articulately than I did. What you just said, I think, is really important. That there's a feeling that you can get writing a poem where something else or someone else is writing through you. You're connected to some other source and you're just the vessel for it. And it's kind of spooky when it happens, but it's really thrilling. And poetry seems like the best means to, the best way to get to that place, uh, for me. But I like what you just said about it. I think that's true.
Yeah. And something I wanted to touch on is, now that we've talked a little bit about surrounding poetry, getting into it and everything, in terms of like the actual material of your poetry, what's the content that you generally write? I know it may be really, there might be a lot of variety, so maybe you don't have to like describe it all so concisely in like a word or two, but just kind of illuminate that for us.
Well, I often start with a form actually, uh, and kind of find my way to what it is that I'm actually writing about through that. So lately, very lately, I've been working on these notebook poems, um, which, I'm literally, for the last few years, I've been carrying around these notebooks with me and just jotting down little bits and pieces of whatever I observe or think, or stupid jokes that come into my head, conversations that I overhear, and I just collect stuff. And over several years of doing this, I've realized that like I'm sort of coming to a new poetic form there. And in sifting through these notes, I've found that what I'm actually writing about, what I've been doing this entire time, collecting these little bits and pieces of language, is thinking about the nature of time passing, the sadness of time passing, um, and the ways in which little shards of experience um, become something more when you put them all together. Um, so that's one example. But I think and write, I guess, a lot about friendship and the relationship between poetry and friendship. I think a lot about what's happening in this particular moment in history, the way that people my age have experienced the world economically, politically, um, culturally. Um, and I think that, language itself and what we were talking about before, the nature of letting someone speak through you, that's also something that I'm thinking about a lot in my poems.
Yeah, I think that part about time and the sadness of time passing is definitely something that I like to write about a lot. I think there's something inherent in it. I think it's because so many people have felt it that I don't think there's anyone out there who could not relate to it for the most part. So I think there's just something universally human about the way writing about that subject feels.
Totally. And this is why New Year's Eve is my favorite holiday, which I have been thinking about in some poems recently, because New Year's Eve is the only holiday, such as it is, that everyone in the world celebrates, as it is, as it were. Time is the only thing, possibly literally the only thing, that everyone experiences together. So I think, yeah, it's something that that everyone can relate to.
Yeah. Uh, just going off of that, I wanted to ask. So you already kind of touched on this when you talked about the way you use notebook poems and stuff. But would you say that like the majority of the times when you get inspired or you look towards writing a work, that's because of a lived experience that you've had?
Um, well, yes, because I think my poems aren't always about events that happened to me, um, but I think that language itself is a lived experience, and what I'm trying to do is capture a lived experience in language as closely as I possibly can. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to, tell a story of something that happened clearly, because sometimes an experience of language is defined by disorder, mishearing something, the possibility of two words coming together and creating some kind of strange effect. Sometimes that's the kind of thing that I'm trying to experience. And I think that it correlates to emotional experience, or, the experience of events in your life happening to you. Uh, but the relationship to that emotional state is sometimes refracted through the language.
Yeah. I think there's a lot there about how expression through language kind of itself also renders an emotion. I think, is that what you're trying to get at, kind of like that idea? Because I think it's just that is kind of, to loop it back around, so crucial in what I think poetry at its heart is, because it's this way to throw together words in as many ways as possible to kind of create that emotional experience within these lines.
Do you remember an emotional experience that you had that made you want to write poetry, like early on before you really knew you were a poet?
Yeah, definitely. I think it was pretty melodramatic actually, funnily. It was like my first crush, I think. It was like a school trip, my first crush. And then like I kind of knew in my head, I was like, well, I don't think there's any reciprocation here.
Uh-huh.
And it was just that feeling got me into like writing some of my first poems, which is actually crazy to think about now. But yeah, it was just like that kind of contrast.
Uh-huh. It's when the reality that you feel doesn't match the reality that you want to
Yeah.
see, or that you're experiencing, you have to write your way towards it somehow. I think that's what
Yeah,
it does.
I think that's an amazing way to put it. I think we can talk a little bit about something else, which is that you mentioned earlier how you like, I want to like kind of shift back to the notebook poems kind of thing that you were talking about earlier, because I think that's really interesting, which is that I've heard a lot of people talk about how they keep things together of things they hear or things they think of throughout the day, and they kind of write those into poems. So kind of what is the ideal with that, in terms of like, are you just putting all these things together in poems, or you collect them in order to then use them as inspiration for poems?
I think um, I've used notebooks, uh, you know, to write poetry for as long as I've written poetry. What's changed in the last few years, I think, is the distinction that you just made. I think that I used to use what I wrote in notebooks to as a springboard into a poem. Or sometimes I would write something down that someone said, or like I misheard someone say something and I thought it was interesting, and that would make its way into a poem. Um, like this, this never made its way into a poem, thank God. But when I was in a cafe once and I heard someone ask for a large salmon latte, and I just thought that was. I knew that I didn't actually hear that, but I thought that it was so hilarious that I wrote it down. Didn't make it into a poem. Wouldn't have been a very good poem probably, but stuff like that over the years I've always collected. Now I'm actually lifting stuff directly from the notebooks and putting them into the poem, but the process is different because there's so much material that I have to wait and wait and wait, um, to let some kind of thread appear to me. So the process of editing a poem, which has always been very long and painstaking for me anyway, became even longer and more painstaking because, the language just like came to me, like it was easy to just fill those notebooks up with whatever I experienced, but rendering it into something that uh, that felt vivid and powerful, and entertaining for that somebody else would maybe want to read, just took an immense amount of patience. It took, probably 2 years of collecting language and then 2 years of sifting it down slowly. And, I got rid of more than half of what I wrote.
Yeah, I think that part is important, that there's a lot in there that goes unused, and it feels a lot like a waste at the time, but it's just kind of, I guess, what happens.
You need to waste time to be a poet.
Yeah.
It's maddening. Writing a poem requires so much wasted time. It's no wonder that that people want to ban these books from schools. Because there's so much wasted time that goes into them.
Yeah, I mean, that's like, you kind of just summed up like the entirety of my experience last year trying to write poetry. It just felt like wasted time, just every single bit of it. So
but wasted time isn't always wasted time. Sometimes wasted time is useful.
Yeah. If you're ready, we can go into the poems now.
Sure. I was thinking I would read 2 sonnets, one newer one, and then one from a book that's come out. So this first one is called November. I think I might hate poetry right now, I texted a friend from my cubicle. That's perfect iambic pentameter, she replied. Go write a fucking sonnet. Fine. I'm learning the words that leave my mouth can up and cross themselves out, like a rose so privatized it reverses its smell, redness inhaled directly from the bud into the obsequious sniffer's face. Or putting it another way, I think poetry is both abstract crime and crime. Better than love and worse, a waste of time, a blunt force way of running down the clock, a sleep that doubles as distant hoofbeats. So that is newer, and this is from this book that came out the end of 2019, shortly before the pandemic, called Fear of Description. And this poem is called Ecstatic Zero. Paradise has a limited vocabulary. Hell is more eloquent. Letters drop off blackened boughs and splash into a stream that feeds down to a fluid realm where poems speak for stones. A little ripple spills into a honking syllable's bill, green scum snapped up from the surface of Narcissus's phone. Then it is still. Interceptor, that face before yours, locked in a razor-thin liquid cell, bears the first fungus, a duplicate life whose harmony is not your own. You open your mouth, and in the water an empty suit turns its head, information and defense spilling from its pit in the shitty willow's boundless shadow.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I love the way those poems sound. And I like the contrast, especially in the first poem. I noticed like the way you immediately like contrasted like the very poetic, like typical poetically, and then you're just like in another way. And then you just straight up went into, I think, a lot of what we just talked about. And I could really see it in those poems.
Oh, thanks, Ethan. I appreciate it.
Do you have any closing remarks you'd like to give before?
It was great to talk to you, and I'm so glad that you're talking to people about poetry, and I hope that the conversations take you even deeper into it.
Thank you.